Greetings, class. This week we examined the epochal clash we term the Cold War, a planet-wide confrontation between two civilizations, two distinct models of modernization, proposed respectively by the United States on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other. We will discuss how this conflict was different from earlier confrontations between great powers. But first, how did the US and the Soviet Union, who after all were allies during World War II between 1941 and 1945 against Nazi fascism, initiate a Cold War by 1946 that would last over 40 years? We have seen that by fall of 1945, Germany and its allies had been defeated by the US, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Earlier that year, the likely winners of the war had looked forward to a post-war world at peace with them as guardians or policemen of the world. This dream of a future world efficiently managed by the World War II allies was signaled, for example, by the establishment of a Security Council at the United Nations constituted by the US, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, plus France and China, both major wartime allies against the Nazis. Yet by 1946, as Winston Churchill, former Prime Minister of Great Britain, announced, an iron curtain had descended across Europe, dividing a capitalist West from a communist East. This division announced a coming broader division of the world into two hostile camps. So what are the steps that led to this global Cold War? In seeking to understand the causes of the Cold War, let's first discuss Soviet factors. The first one was the determination of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, to impose the communist system on the Eastern European countries the Red or Soviet army had occupied by 1945 in its successful effort to defeat Hitler. Never again, determined Stalin, would Eastern Europe be used as a launching pad for an invasion of the Soviet Union, as had been the case in June of 1941 when Hitler had unleashed a surprise attack on the Soviet Union known as Operation Barbarossa. Pro-Soviet communist governments were imposed by the Russians in countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and eventually a newly created country of East Germany. And in addition, Stalin, while not intending in the least to start a new world war he could barely ever afford with the West by invading the capitalist half of Europe, reactivated through a new organization, Cominform, his support for the powerful communist parties that existed in the Western capitalist democracies, hoping thus to spread communism over time through peaceful and democratic means, in other words, through the elections in democratic countries. Stalin, in other words, revived after World War II the old Leninist dream of spreading communism across Europe and the world through peaceful revolution or through force if necessary. Another major factor that explains the coming of the Cold War was the determination of the United States to make sure communism would not take over Western Europe. The threat of communism in Western Europe was not so much military as it was linked to the European democratic multi-party system. The Soviet Union and communism as an ideology in general had emerged from victory in World War II with enormous prestige, including among the working class in the West. In addition, a profound economic and social crisis swept across Europe right after the war, fueling discontent and causing industrial workers everywhere to support socialist and communist parties. France and Italy in particular, both countries critical to European stability, sported huge communist parties, and crucial elections were planned there in 1946 and 1948 respectively. The Americans and their anti-communist European allies were terrified the communists would come to power peacefully through democratic elections. In other countries such as Greece, a civil war pitted anti-communists against communists. This tremendous post-war instability raised the specter of a domino effect. If one country fell to communism, fear the Americans, others would follow, and soon the European continent would be once again under the control of a totalitarian power, this time Soviet, not Nazi as during World War II. Such fears led to a revival of Wilsonian calls of American engagement and entanglement in European affairs. In response to these fears, by 1949, the United States had committed sizable financial, in-kind, and military resources to shoring up the Western capitalist democracies. The Truman Doctrine, first proclaimed by FDR's successor to the presidency, Harry Truman, established a principle that the U.S. would oppose attempts to undermine pro-American regimes by force or otherwise. The National Security Act was passed, which created the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA was charged with covert or secret anti-communist operations abroad, including financial support for anti-communist parties everywhere. The first recipient of CIA funding were the anti-communist Italian parties, which were able then to defeat the communist and socialist parties in the Italian elections of 1948. Most impactful, though, perhaps, was the Marshall Plan, officially known as the European Recovery Program, a foreign aid program that helped the Western capitalist democracies survive economic crisis and even embark after 1950 on a spectacular economic recovery. Finally, in response to Western European requests for American military help, in 1949 the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was created, which pledged all participants, including from the outset France, Great Britain, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and the US and Canada, to come to each other's defense if under attack from communist foreign forces. The Soviet Union, in response, moved both to shore up its control over what came to be known as its satellites, meaning subordinated countries of Eastern Europe. In 1948, the democratically elected government of Czechoslovakia was violently replaced with a pro-Soviet one. Similar events elsewhere in Eastern Europe were orchestrated by Soviet and pro-Soviet agents. Economic cooperation with what came to be known as the Socialist Bloc was organized in response to the West's Marshall Plan. Likewise, in 1955, the Soviet answer to NATO was established, the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance binding the Soviet-controlled countries in the East. So, by 1949, Europe was permanently divided into two halves, one capitalist, the other communist. The Cold War had begun, and initially played itself out for the most part only in Europe. But why did it soon become a global phenomenon that would last 40 years? We will next examine how and why. But before we turn to the global geographic reach of the Cold War, it is important to note that the Cold War was a clash of two distinct ways of life, of two opposed ideologies, both of which had originated in Europe, but which would now divide the world. The Cold War was a competition for the hearts and minds of ordinary citizens everywhere, who were asked to pledge their support for one political, social, and economic system and to reject the opposing system. Either system claimed to be superior to its rival, and each one promised to deliver a better life to citizens than its rival. The American-led capitalist system strove to address citizen needs by beefing up welfare states that guaranteed minimum living standards through full employment, pension funds, free education, universal free healthcare, etc. In addition, the capitalist West pandered to citizens' consumer cravings. The peace and prosperity that followed World War II spurred the growth of a consumer market which was unprecedented in scope and size in human history. With basic living needs met by welfare states, especially in countries where social democratic states were robust, such as Sweden or Canada, the good life increasingly meant being able to buy lots of desired objects. In the United States, where the welfare state was minimal, consumerism played an even more important role. In this arena of competition, consumerism, however, the socialist bloc, as the communist world was known, had a particularly hard time keeping up with the capitalist West. Capitalism, as Adam Smith had predicted back in 1776, proved far more effective in producing quality goods in right quantities and at the right price. The communist command and control economies of the East, on the other hand, were quite ineffective in this area. For example, cars produced in the socialist bloc tended to be of low quality and were not produced in sufficient quantities to meet consumer demand. Over time, even more than the sometimes shoddy welfare states of the socialist bloc, the failure of communism to satisfy its consumers would prove a serious weakness, which would ultimately discredit communism and help bring down the Soviet bloc between 1989 and 1991. But in the meantime, and as late as the 1970s, Soviet state planners could credibly claim to provide living standards that were competitive with those available in Western capitalist societies. As an illustration of the competition between capitalism and communism for the hearts and minds of the world's citizens and consumers, there is no better example than the famous kitchen debate of 1959 between Soviet General Secretary Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, and American Vice President Richard Nixon and future president. Khrushchev and Nixon televised debate broadcast the respective merits of their communist or capitalist systems at a time when it was still conceivable that communism might just beat capitalism in the future. After all, the Soviets had then an advantage in space exploration, having placed Sputnik, humanity's first artificial satellite, in orbit a couple of years earlier. Such Soviet technological prowess seemed to announce future accomplishments in other areas too. Let's now turn to the question of how a Cold War begun in Europe became a global Cold War that would last some 4 decades. There were several factors that helped spread the Cold War to all corners of the earth, but the most important was doubtless the end of the European empires that followed the conclusion of World War II. After World War II, try as they might, European imperial powers such as Great Britain, the Netherlands, and France were not able to maintain over the longer term control over their Afro-Asian colonies. And as former colonies across the world became independent in the late 1940s, 50s, 60s, and finally 70s, their leaders and peoples were faced with a choice. Would the newly independent countries embrace the liberal capitalist model of civilization promoted by the Americans? Or on the contrary, would they adopt the Soviet communist model of civilization? From the point of view of colonized peoples, both models had their attractions, but also disadvantages. The capitalist model was associated with the promise of foreign investment and alliance with the foremost superpower, the United States. But it was also associated with colonial and capitalist extraction of native resources, as we have seen. In this respect, the Soviet communist model had actually considerable appeal at the time. The Soviet Union was not associated with colonial exploitation, and the communist model's emphasis on nationalizing resources and of industrial development through state action was attractive to countries that had been forced for decades, even centuries, to serve as a source of solely raw materials and cash crops for the capitalist West. By the same token, though, alliance with the Soviet Union might earn the antagonism, the hostility of the West and of the United States, inviting covert and destabilizing interventions and cutting off a country from Western investment. As countries became independent across Afro-Asia, former European colonial powers and their especially superpower ally, the United States, tried mightily to influence their choices. On their side, the Soviets did the same, trying to convince newly independent former colonies to adopt communism and to join the socialist bloc. A U.S.-Soviet global rivalry ensued, one which resorted on either side to propaganda, to attempts to influence elections by supporting friendly political parties, but also, and most tragically, support for guerrillas fighting for either capitalist or communist causes. The result was a string of lethal proxy wars in which the Soviets supported one faction within a country and the U.S. another, resulting in often horrendous civil wars. Such proxy wars were numerous and very lethal. It is an insufficiently known fact that about 25 million people died in Cold War proxy wars across the planet between 1946 and 1991. The map shown here of the world around 1985 shows you the U.S. and NATO allies in dark blue, other U.S. allies in lighter blue. In red are marked the Soviet Union, its Warsaw Pact, Eastern European satellites, and pink, Soviet allies everywhere. China is colored yellow because, while communist since 1949, it was not aligned by the 1960s with the Soviet Union. Countries with ongoing proxy wars are marked with crosses, either blue to indicate American-supported anti-communist rebels, or red dots to signal communist-supported anti-capitalist rebels. In such areas, Cold War-related civil wars raged on, producing countless victims. So, it should be said that the global Cold War was cold only in name and by virtue of the fact that Europe remained at peace and no World War III broke out. But otherwise, it truly was a collection of extremely hot and very tragic wars fought over years and years across the globe with countless victims. Generally speaking, few countries were able to avoid alliance with one Cold War camp or the other. Such were the pressures to choose a camp during the Cold War. You are either with us or you are against us, was the Cold War doctrine of both the U.S. on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other. But in 1955, however, newly independent countries gathered in Bandung, Indonesia, to try to establish an effective non-aligned movement. But the outcomes were modest. Many members of the non-aligned movement were ultimately forced in effect to choose camps, experienced Cold War-related civil wars, or pretended to be non-aligned even though they were, as was the case for communist Cuba after 1959. As a general rule, most of the vulnerable, newly independent countries were forced to choose either communism or capitalism. The actual process of decolonization, which was so important in fueling US-Soviet Cold War rivalry stretched over time, can be described as occurring in three phases, as illustrated in the following maps. A first phase coincided and followed World War II, building on both pre-war independence movements and new dynamics occasioned by World War II, namely the weakness of Western colonial powers consequent to their temporary wartime defeats at the hands of the Japanese and the Germans. In the 1940s and early 50s, a number of major and smaller countries attained their independence, sometimes more or less peacefully, other times as the result of civil wars and colonial conflict. Among them, British India, which immediately split into two independent states, largely organized by religious faith, Muslim Pakistan and Hindu India. A second phase of decolonization, particularly associated to the African continent, accelerated in the 1960s. It should be emphasized here that the great European colonial empires emerged bruised and impoverished, but in many cases still determined to hang on to their most prized colonial possessions. This was particularly true the case for France, which fought a brutal war to retain its North African colony of Algeria, only relenting in the mid-60s after a brutal civil war that killed hundreds of thousands of Algerians. The third and final phase of decolonization came in the 70s, when after a change of regime, Portugal, interestingly the most ancient of the European empires, finally gave up its African colonies, notably Mozambique and Angola. In the latter country, which became a close ally of communist Cuba, a bloody proxy war flared up due to the intrusion of South African and US-backed anti-communist forces in a conflict which sadly characterized the transition to independence of so many former European colonies. So you see, the long-awaited independence of some of the peoples of the world was unfortunately accompanied by strife and war. And the fact that newly independent countries were in many cases forced to choose a camp has led observers to ask the question, did the Cold War create a new kind of colonialism known as neo-colonialism, this time centered around the two new superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, that had replaced, after World War II, the European great powers? This is a historical question I ask you to debate and write about after reading this topic's secondary source, the excerpt from historian Adorn and Westad's book, The Global Cold War, Third World Interventions and the Makings of Our Time. You will see that there are ways in which a new form of colonialism can be said to have come into play, but one which was, however, very different from the imperialism practiced earlier before World War II by the old European empires. How so is what we will debate. I want to conclude with brief mention of one of the most important legacies of the global Cold War, global terrorism and the war on terrorism. The horrendous wars that occurred during the Cold War, plus the support of either superpower of repressive dictatorships in the Third World, have left a very bitter legacy. The best example is the rise of radical Islam and the attack on the Twin Towers of September 11, 2001, one decade after the end of the Cold War. In the 1980s, the U.S. supported with weapons and aid what it called freedom fighters, Afghan resistance fighters seeking to expel the Soviets from their country after their invasion of December of 1979. Famously, then U.S. President Ronald Reagan received a number of Afghan fighters at the White House, portrayed here in a photo, hailing them as freedom fighters. But among such fighters, though not one received at the White House, was an Arab, Osama bin Laden, a millionaire who had traveled to Afghanistan to support resistance against the Soviets. By 1987, the Soviets under new leadership had decided to withdraw from Afghanistan, marking the defeat of the Soviet effort and the triumph of the insurgents. This was seen as a triumph for Islam by Osama bin Laden, a triumph over what he held to be the corrupting influence of Western civilization, whether capitalist or communist. And because bin Laden lumped together the two Cold War rivals, the Soviet Union and the US, he next turned his hostile attention to the US, having defeated the Soviet Union. Sheltered by the fundamentalist Islamic regime of the Taliban that followed Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, bin Laden used the latter country as a base from which to launch terrorist attacks against US interests in the late 1990s. Then, on September 11, 2001, Osama bin Laden orchestrated the attacks on the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon in Washington. The rest is history, namely contemporary or current history. So you see, the tragedies of the Cold War created more tragedies that continue to plague the world. Among such unfortunate legacies of the global Cold War is also, to some extent, world economic inequality. Countries that adopted the communist model did not do well economically for the same reasons that brought down the Soviet Union by 1991, as we will see. And alliance with the US during the Cold War and adoption of free market capitalism in some cases did help develop formerly poor colonies, especially when coupled with inclusive democratic institutions, South Korea being the best example of such successes. But in other cases, extraction and exploitation at the hands of dictators allied with US and Western capitalist interests continued to produce poverty and underdevelopment in many former colonies.